So we're going to turn back to the concept of whole body metabolism here, looking at the concept of diets and bad diets as it relates to nutrition and eating. So what we have to remember is what we're talking about is we're talking about things like caloric and nutritional balance here. And what we remember is that a calorie is developed based off of the specific heat of water. And we have to remember is that there are two distinct types of calories that we're going to be talking about. We're talking about the chemical calorie, which is the amount of energy necessary to raise 1 gram of water 1 degree centigrade, or the dietary calorie, which is the equivalent of a kilocalorie or 1000 calories, or the amount of energy required to increase the temperature of 1 kilogram of water 1 degree centigrade. And what to remember here is we are looking at specific heat of water and the specific density of water, which is 1, which means that 1 gram is equivalent of 1 milliliter, and 1 kilogram is the equivalent of 1 liter in terms of temperature uh, as relates to the volume of water or the mass of water. When we talk about whole body issues, we're usually talking about the dietary or the kilocalorie unit. We're going to measure it two ways. We can measure it via a conversion of energy expenditure in terms of either a kilowatt hour or kilojoule converted into the uh, calorie through the conversion ratios, or talking about the metabolic equivalent, which is the amount of energy being expended per kilogram per hour, where at rest we use a single MET, and then every time we start increasing our energy expenditure, we'll increase that MET equivalent. When we use exercise equipment, the indication of caloric expenditure is based off of the amount of energy being utilized, not necessarily the amount of energy being expended by your body, which is why the energy expenditure coming from the exercise equipment is actually not very accurate in terms of overall caloric expenditure. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about the exercise response within lab. Most of the discussion relating around whole body metabolism and diet is based off of the indication of a caloric balance as it relates to body mass gain or body mass loss. However, this is an inaccurate indication due to the changes of hormonal signaling regulating whole body basal metabolic rate that we looked at with ghrelin and leptin's influence off of the hypothalamus, which is why when we talk about the issues of balance and determining of metabolic rate, it's more about nutrient or fuel balance. That is, what fuels am I intaking and what fuels are being expended, where we're going to be in either a nutrient balance positive, and a nutrient balance positive will lead to an increase of body mass. And once again, we cannot gain or lose at a specific tissue. We'll gain and lose everywhere based off of hormonal signaling. Whereas if we are in a negative fuel balance, we're going to be losing body mass. And once again, you cannot lose from a specific spot. You'll be losing across all body tissues. And based off of cortisol signaling within the counter-regulatory response, as relates to the glucose sparing events, we could actually be losing excessive amounts of free fat mass or fat-free mass relative to the fat mass, and can be deleterious towards overall health status. And so what things are going to be determining our metabolic rate and our fuel utilization? Well, it's about the energy utilization per day based off of our basal metabolic rates. And these basal metabolic rates will be affected by things like gender and age, which are non-modifiable, as well as things like body composition, activity level, and overall health status, which will be modifiable factors that are going to alter hormonal signals, which will alter genetic and epigenetic regulators. These modifiable factors can lead to both an overestimation and an underestimation of energetic needs. And this is where, when you're dealing with your patients and your clients, what you have to remember is that when you're determining basal metabolic rates per the regression equation, you have to modify it based off of several key indicators in regards to what is happening to their morphology. Because once again, if I'm going into a positive nutrient balance, I'll start putting on body mass. And if I'm not putting on the correct type of body mass, I will actually go into a deleterious health effect, like we looked at in terms of the eating disorders as relates to the obesity issue, in terms of anabolic dysregulation effects. And so, as we get into the issues of the fad diets and doing dietary recalls and looking at our ways of eating, we have to remember a few things: that the change in body mass will be independent of any acute caloric balance. That is, what I do today will not directly alter my body mass. Body mass should not vary very much on a day-to-day basis. However, over multiple days, you may see changes. However, this is not due to the caloric balance, it's more due to the nutrient balance issue by changes of hormonal signals that occur due to the nutrient balance associated with the change of hormones due to physical activity. And once again, we can never gain or lose from a single tissue unless we're using the quote unquote magic wand of liposuction. In terms of eating, there is indications based off of several meta-analytical studies that indicate that eating multiple small meals throughout the day in small sizes, both in terms of the amount of nutrients as well as the caloric density of nutrients, is more beneficial than eating a few meals throughout the day. The smaller meals lead to avoiding of overeating by training the alimentary canal to induce the short reflex sooner within the response. This will allow you to elicit a larger body mass change when we have equal hypocaloric balance or hyponutrient balance, as well as elicit a greater ability to maintain the body mass change when we have equal caloric balance or equal nutrient balance. There is some new evidence looking at the intermittent fasting. However, there is very little intermittent fasting data to indicate that it is more beneficial than the multiple small meals throughout the day. We should never skip breakfast. Now, here's the issue with the breakfast thing: is breakfast is always your first meal of the day. So it doesn't matter whether it's during the traditional breakfast hours or at some point later in the day. The first meal is always going to be breakfast. However, the earlier you can put in that first meal, the better it is at establishing the initial set for fuel utilization by minimizing the early morning cortisol bursts that take place. In terms of hydration issues, consuming a carbohydrate or substitute, a fake sugar or a low, no sugar beverage with electrolytes in terms of both sodium as well as potassium chlorides will allow for greater recovery. By consuming the carbohydrate substitute, it's going to minimize the total cortisol response that we see, which is going to allow for improved recovery and improved hydration status. However, regardless of what the companies selling the beverages are trying to sell you, there is no actual performance benefit that we get from these beverages. It can delay the onset of full dehydration issues. However, it doesn't actually improve performance. It may slow down the rate at which performance is degraded. There is little treatment effect to additional protein consumption as long as protein consumption meets the minimum requirements, where you're going to want to consume somewhere between about 1.8 and 2.5 grams per kilogram of body mass for people who are in a hypocaloric state, and around 1.4 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body mass for people who are in a eucaloric state. Any additional protein will not induce additional hypertrophication, regardless of what the company selling the protein supplements might tell you. Additionally, additional protein within the diet will not gain mass from eating of normal protein sources, such as beef and chicken and pork. The other thing in terms of the protein consumption is that independent of changes of physical activity, it will not elicit increase of fat-free mass. It simply becomes additional sources of nitrogens within the body, and it can lead to excessive uh, production of various enzymatic properties within the liver, leading to changes of liver enzymes that may indicate a liver toxicity. People who have issues with conversions of low density lipoproteins should be wary of adding additional protein to their diet. People who have issues with acidosis should be wary of adding additional protein to their diet. Moreover, protein will be naturally being degraded within the body as we age due to inflammatory signals, which means that for older individuals, they should be consuming protein at a level that equates to what we would put somebody on a hypocaloric diet on, as long as their kidneys and their livers are able to handle the excessive protein load. The other thing we have to remember is that the food pyramids are not laws. They're not something that we have to follow. The food pyramid themselves have been changed slightly to indicate the my plate or the food plate, which is more of a pie chart to indicate the relative balance of foods. The problem with both the food pyramid as well as the food plate is that it's not really based on the overall science that's out there. It's more of a political stance in terms of what should be eaten. In terms of eating, if we're hungry or starving, what you have to remember is that it may be simply due to a cognitive drive, meaning that we're looking for a dopamine fix. And so we may want to try to do something before we actually start consuming things to make sure that it is not due to boredom or the need for a dopamine fix. When we select foods, we need to make sure these foods are quote unquote good food choices. Now, good food choices is not an indication that there are good foods and bad foods. What it's an indication of, are we getting all of the nutrients that is necessary within the foods that we're eating? When teaching people about foods, do not indicate that foods are good or bad. It's about the choices that are being made, not the foods themselves. In making these good food choices, what we have to remember is that there is a necessity to eat fiber so as to keep the alimentary canal motility normal. And for adults, that means that we have to have at least 30 grams of fiber per day. So, what should I be eating? Well, remember, there's no such thing as a magic diet, regardless of what people are trying to sell you. Most diets should meet the minimum requirements that have been mentioned, which means that we should have, in terms of a normal healthy person, somewhere between 40 and 50% of dietary requirements being met through consumptions of carbohydrates, which includes fiber. 20 to 30% should be made up of proteins and amino acid sources. 20 to 30% should be made up of lipids. For people who have cardiovascular disease or people who are overweight or overfat, a lower carbohydrate, higher protein is better for them than a low fat diet in both health status as well as in change of body morphology. When consuming lipids, we want to make sure that the lipids are consumed in a mixture of unsaturated, either the PUFAs, the polyunsaturated, or the MUFAs, the monounsaturateds, and saturated fats. The advised ratio is somewhere between 3 to 1 and 4 to 1 in between the unsaturated and the saturated. And when consuming, because we cannot digest them down, you should avoid trans fats within your diet because the trans fats will act as saturated fats and can actually be more deleterious to health than the saturated fats themselves.